So the notions that we are going to define here will come up again and again. So please become completely familiar with them. And to gain comfort level, try to see as many examples as well as non-examples as you can. So the first thing that we want to define is a subring of a ring R. In analogy with the way subgroups and vector subspaces were defined, we would like to say that this is a subset of R, that is a ring in its own right with the same operations of addition and multiplication. But in addition, we have to add one more condition here, namely that the one in the ring must be part of the subset. So to see the necessity of this condition, consider this subset of the ring Z mod 6Z, and as an exercise, please check for yourself right now that this subset under the operations inherited from this ring is a ring in its own right. So do it now. Okay, so you should have realized that these three elements form a subgroup under addition, and it is also closed under multiplication. But moreover, just within these three elements, the congruence class of 4 works as the multiplicative identity. So this subset is actually a ring, but we do not regard it as a subring of Z mod 6Z because the identity is not the same as the one in here. Okay? So later on we will see a conceptual reason behind why this example comes about. But I want to make another point here, which is that in order to check that this is a ring, we did not really need to verify conditions like associativity of addition, multiplication, or distributivity, because such properties are true in the ambient ring, and so therefore they are inherited by any subset as long as that subset is closed under the requisite operations. So to check that a subset is a subring of R, all that you really need to do is to see that it is closed under addition, subtraction, multiplication, and has the same one element as in R. Okay, so please try to see as many examples of subrings as you can, and let's move on to the next one. So a unit is just an invertible element of a ring. So why do we have a different word? Well, because it's a standard terminology, and it's slightly unfortunate because unity for a binary operation is sometimes this word is used to denote the neutral element or the identity element. So this terminology is somewhat unfortunate, but it is standard, so we will just live with it. And in many cases, it is interesting and useful to find out the units in a ring. So please do that right now for all the examples over here. Okay. So in many of these cases it is easy. The units in the ring of integers are 1 and minus 1. The next three are fields, and so therefore here every non-zero element has an inverse and therefore is a unit. The next two examples are a little more interesting. In the ring of Gaussian integers, there are exactly 4 units, 1, minus 1, I and minus I. So you can easily see that all of these have inverses. To show that there are no other units, it's useful to consider the complex conjugate. So for complex numbers a and b, if a times b is 1, then immediately you get that a bar times b bar is also equal to 1, and so therefore a bar times b bar is also 1. In other words, if a is a unit, then a times a bar is a positive integer, that is a unit in Z, and so this then immediately allows you to conclude that there are only 4 units in the ring of Gaussian integers. In integers modulo n, units are going to be precisely those congruence classes such that the numbers in them are relatively prime to n, and the way one sees this is by the exact same argument that we used to show that Z mod nz is a field precisely when n is a prime number. Okay, so our next notion is of a zero divisor. For example, in the rings Z mod 6Z, 2 and 3 are non-zero, but their product is 0. So in a ring, if I have the product of two non-zero things to be 0, then I call them zero divisors. Formally speaking, is the zero element a zero divisor? Because it is possible that to take A to be 0, and then any non-zero element B will satisfy A times B is equal to 0. So whether to consider 0 a zero divisor or not is a matter of opinion. But for us it's an unimportant issue. So I will tacitly assume that every zero divisor is a non-zero element. Okay. The next notion is an important one. So I call a ring an integral domain, or sometimes just a domain, if the following does not happen. So what I do not want happening is that two non-zero elements multiplying to 0. In other words, in an integral domain, if AB is 0 and if A is not 0, then B must be 0. Okay. So what I have listed here is several exercises about integral domains, and at this point you should stop, see all the exercises and try to solve all of them on your own. None of them is difficult and they're all quite useful, so please pause right now and do them. Okay, so let's see the answers to these exercises. Again, if you did not do the exercises yourself, then it's of little use to see me work them out over here. So if you did not do them, please pause and attempt them yourself. Alright, so the first one, I want to show that a field is an integral domain. So let's take a non-zero element. I know that it's invertible, so call this element A. If AB is 0, then just multiplying this equation by A inverse gives me that B is equal to 0 as desired. Alright. Now the defining property of a domain passes to any subset, and so therefore in particular a subring of a domain is immediately seen to be a domain. If you have a field, a subring need not be a field. Examples are easy. For example, integers inside rational numbers. However, a subring of a field is going to be a domain simply because a field is a domain and a subring of a domain is a domain. For the cancellation property, let us take a non-zero A and let's suppose that AB is equal to AC. Now A may not be invertible, so I cannot just multiply this equation by A inverse. But since I am in a ring, I can subtract and get AB minus AC is equal to 0. By using distributivity, I can take A to be a common factor and conclude that A times B minus C is equal to 0. Now I am in this situation. I have an integral domain and A is non-zero, so therefore that gives me that B minus C is 0. In other words, B is equal to C. Now the statement that I have written over here is just a direct reformulation of the cancellation property, but it is useful to formulate it in this fashion. And one use is that it allows us to give a solution to the next exercise. So I am given a finite integral domain. So that means that this ring R is finite and the left multiplication by A map from R to R is injective. But now what do I have? I have an injective map from a set to a set of the same cardinality, and this cardinality is finite. So therefore, by pigeonhole principle if you like, this map is automatically surjective also. In other words, this AX will take all possible values in R. In particular, it will take the value 1, which is an element of R. And so when I get AX equal to 1, that X is the desired inverse of A. So the last definition is the most important one, and we define ring homomorphism, which I will often call a map of rings or just a ring map, as follows. You define a function from a source ring to a target ring to be a ring homomorphism if it preserves addition, multiplication, and sends 1 in the source to 1 in the target. This definition should not be surprising in view of the definitions that you have already seen for a group homomorphism and a linear map. So this is in the same vein. Okay. As usual, the operations on the left are the ones in the source, and the operations on the right hand side are taking place in the target. Okay. So before we get to examples, one quick comment. The first condition states that phi is a homomorphism of additive groups, and therefore automatically it will send 0 to 0. And you should quickly revise the proof of this for the following reason. If you try to imitate the same proof and try to show that 1 in the source must go to 1 in the target purely on the strength of the second condition, you will see that the proof fails, and the reason is that a priori I do not know that phi of 1 is something that is invertible in the target. Okay. This is a real restriction, because I can very easily come up with an example where the first two conditions are met but the last one is not. And to do so, just take any ring R, any ring S, and define the map phi, taking every element in R to 0 in S. You can see that this meets the first two conditions but not the last one. Okay, but I do want the last condition to be valid, so I impose it. A couple of easy examples. The first one is a map from Z to integers modulo n, and this is just the quotient map taking any integer to the coset containing it. So you already know that this is a group homomorphism, but in fact it also preserves multiplication just by how we define multiplication in the target. A second easy example is the inclusion of a subring into its ambient ring. Here again, just by definition of a subring, addition and multiplication are preserved because they are the same as in the ambient ring, and we impose the condition on a subring that it must contain the one in the ambient ring. So the third condition is also met. Alright. So we need to build more familiarity with ring homomorphisms, and for that I have given you an exercise over here. This exercise will take some work, so you should do this on your own time, maybe right after this lecture. And there are three examples here. So I have asked you to take the list of your favorite rings, and for each one of them I am asking you to find all homomorphisms from Z to R, and similarly all homomorphisms from Z mod NZ, and also from this ring. So by notation, this is the set of all polynomials in a single variable x with integer coefficients. Okay. So please do make sure to spend time thinking about all of these examples, because each one of them has something valuable to teach us. In fact, ring homomorphisms are going to be vital for everything that we are going to do in this course. So in order to prepare for that, here's what I strongly recommend that you do. Okay. So what you should do is the following. You have already seen groups, group homomorphisms and quotient groups. Likewise, you have seen vector spaces, linear maps and quotient spaces. In both of these situations, you have the first isomorphism theorem. So you should completely familiarize yourself with this isomorphism theorem in either situation. And in fact, at a more basic level, you can even prove a first isomorphism theorem for a plane function between just sets, right? So what this will involve is you will have to define a quotient set for this of the source set using a suitable equivalence relation. Okay. So in all three of these situations, you should be able to do the following. You should be able to precisely state the isomorphism theorem. You should be able to prove it, and you should be able to give several examples. And you should be able to do this without looking at any book or any notes. In other words, you can say that you should be able to teach this to somebody without having to think about it. Okay. So, doing this is going to take some time and effort. So, spend whatever time is needed, whether it's half an hour, 2 hours, or whatever. Okay. But doing this is going to be well worth the effort. Okay. And the payoff is going to be the following. In about 2 to 3 lectures, we will start studying ring homomorphisms and quotient rings in detail. At that time, if you have done all of this work, the new development is going to look very familiar to you, and therefore mentally it will be very easy. More immediately, for the next class, please revise long division of polynomials. So maybe work out an example and then formulate precisely what it means to say that we can do long division of polynomials. Then prove this statement by induction on degree, and then apply it to prove the remainder theorem, which you have seen in high school. If you can, also read the definition of a general polynomial ring in one variable, where the coefficients can come from an arbitrary commutative ring. I want to end by acknowledging that in this lecture I introduced a number of notions, and to become familiar with all of them, it is going to take time and effort. But there is a secret in making this process easier, and that is to build in your mind a list of good examples. Okay, so to apply this in our situation, you are actually in a pretty good position because you have already worked with a large number of rings and with some of the most important ones even from high school. So please do not think of this course as difficult. Of course, you cannot learn any new mathematics without serious effort, but for rings, if you are able to draw upon your experience appropriately, then this course can actually be quite a pleasant effort and you will learn a lot of cool algebra in the process. So we stop for today, and tomorrow we will continue with polynomial rings.